All right, so we are here with Simeon White, application consultant for NAV and Business Central, and today we're going to be talking about user security, setup and management. And when we talk about user security, I think what that really is encompassing here, especially for the purposes of this discussion, is the setup and management of the role centers that you use. So, what does a user see when they log in? And also the permission sets. The permission sets which control specifically what a user can do once they're in there, right? So it is different than the role centers, which presents certain options maybe to the users, and they kind of work together in several ways. Which we're going to dive into here. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage for this discussion. We're going to talk, like I said, the good, the bad, and the ugly of managing users in Business Central and security. Simeon's got years of experience working with many, many companies and helping them set up security. So we hope that the goal of today is to provide some insights into best practices on managing security, maybe some things to avoid, or if nothing else, a validation of what you may have experienced with setting up security. And, to say, because I could see sometimes people might go, I can't be doing this right. Is this really what I have to do this? So maybe we'll at least give you some peace of mind and validation that, oh my gosh, yes, this is what I'm seeing here. I'm not doing something wrong. So thanks again for Simeon for being here. Go ahead.
Role centers and permissions go hand in hand. Ken was just saying. My mistake.
Have another Modelo.
You have another Modelo, yeah. What would you say that companies tend to do first? Set up a role center or dive into like custom permissions?
Well, everybody has a role center when they start with Business Central. So let's use an example of getting into a new implementation. So you're getting into a new implementation, users are getting in for the first time, they're looking around, and the first thing a thing early on in an implementation that people often want to see is permissions. They've heard that Business Central has permissions and users can be restricted. So right off the bat, people are usually really wanting to restrict things down, lock the system down, and they come to me to do that portion of the setup. And a lot of times that's what it is. They really want to lock things down. So the first thing I do is I tell people to take a step back and think about what you really want and what do you really need, because people always want to lock everything down, make sure no one can get into stuff they shouldn't touch and everything. But I want customers to ask themselves first and evaluate what type of organization are they at? Is it 5 people? And what kind of system do they currently have? And what is the current security? Because often when I ask that question, say it's a smaller company, 5 or 10 people, often I'll say that. So you really want security and everything. How secure is everything now? And oftentimes, the system's wide open currently. Everyone can get into everything. You have a lot of problems? Not usually. People do what they're supposed to do. They don't get into other things. So then the question turns into, do you really need security? Or do you just need to modify the role centers? And then they start thinking about it and become a little more realistic. So I want people to start out with paper. Put it on paper. What do you need? And then think about, is it what you really need? And sleep on it and come back to it. Maybe it's 100-person organization and they're coming from a system where they don't have security and they've had problems. Or they do have security in their previous system. Then maybe they do need a little bit more. But getting back to like a smaller organization, you might just need to modify your role centers. Maybe everyone has full access and everyone has full access, super users to the system, but they get specific roles that give them just what they need to see on the screen. And you take away options you don't want them to see, and if they really dug for it, they could get into it, but they just don't. And that might be good enough. It's not always worth going down the path of locking every single thing down and spending all these hours to do this, it might not really be necessary. So I want people to evaluate first what they really need and then get into it. And if they do need it, which they might, then we'll get into it.
So think before you act.
Yes.
Put a plan in place. What are you really trying to accomplish?
Yeah, it sounds great. Security. Do you want security in your house?
Everyone
Yes.
wants security.
Yes.
Sure, yeah.
But do you need a video camera on every angle of your entire home at all times, monitoring everything? Probably not.
Right.
So, or maybe you do. I don't know. It depends. Everyone's unique. Everyone's different. So what do you need? So
What does well, let me ask you this. What does Microsoft provide out of the box? So if it's a new Business Central implementation and I do want to set up my 20 users, let's say, what's my starting point? What does Microsoft provide out of the box?
So if you go into the permission sets, you'll see that there's a lot of permission sets, maybe 50 or more. Permission sets of various names. BC, full access, super, team user. There's different permission sets that sound pretty good. There's ones for accountants, one for external accountants, things like that. And they seem like they might be a good fit. Purchasing agent one, sales representative.
Those
sales
sound like
manager.
role centers.
Yeah, some of those are role centers.
So they've kind of created a permission set for each role center, like an equivalent?
It seems like it, but not.
Okay.
Not really the case. So you could go to the Purchasing Agent Role Center, which is a role center. We'll define what that is. That's the look and feel of your screens. So if I put somebody in the Purchasing Agent Role Center, it's going to show on the home screen queue tiles that have your purchase quotes, purchase orders, things that a purchasing person would need to see. So the logical thought is, then I just need to put the purchaser in the Purchasing Role Center, give them the purchasing permission sets, and case closed. They have everything they need. And
yeah, of course. That sounds right.
it sounds right, and that's what people think, and it has never worked. I've done maybe 20, 40, 60 some implementations of permissions, and it is never the case because each customer is unique, every business is unique, and the purchasing person almost never just strictly does out-of-the-box purchasing exactly as defined by Microsoft. Yeah. They always need a little more, or they always need a little bit less.
So can I change in Business Central? Can I change that purchasing role permission set to remove stuff and add stuff?
So in the old system, in Nav, you could go in Nav and you could just modify permissions. Just like you could go into objects and just modify objects and do things. In Business Central, you're no longer allowed to change any permission sets. And there's a good reason for that. You can copy a permission set and then you can make changes to the copy. But you can't change the base permission set. And the good reason is when updates come out, Microsoft actually updates those permission sets for you. So you don't want to touch the base.
Okay. Sounds like a positive.
Is a role center effectively adding permissions to you when you're in that role, or is it just restricting you from seeing certain things?
A role center has nothing to do with permissions, but they're very closely interact with each other. So a role center is literally just the pages that you can see, the look and feel of the screens, the column layouts and everything. But the permissions are what allow you to actually see the data behind them. So if you don't have access via permissions to certain things on the role center, you can't use it, or you may not see it.
Yeah, the simplest example, Michael, is there's a sales and relationship manager role center, right? That's designed for a salesperson. So when they log in, they see customers, contacts, sales quotes, opportunities, and orders and things, versus a warehouse worker role center that has on the main page you log into warehouse picks, warehouse putaways, movements, things like that, receiving functions. So it's really just it's what do we want to present to the user when they log in.
So you could effectively have, let's say, a super permission, but be under the sales and manager role center,
Yes.
and still be able to access whatever you want in the system.
Yeah,
You're
so
just not seeing.
yeah, so let's use the example I Ken said of the warehouse worker. So the warehouse worker role center gives you access to things that the warehouse person, say they're shipping, needs to see to do their job every day. So say it's a small company, and there's 2 guys that work in the warehouse, and they work closely with the owner and a couple people in the office. So say it's 5 people in the company, and everyone knows each other. It's a small company, and everything's always been fine. They don't want to deal with security. They give everyone super user access. Everyone can technically get into everything, but the warehouse guy, he has a warehouse role center. So the things he needs to see are on the screen in front of him. That's the benefit of the role center. I can see what I need right in front of me. Now, take that example and put it in a large company where you have numerous warehouse employees and they all have the warehouse role center, but it's a 100-person company and you need to lock it down more, and you don't want all these random employees going into your chart of accounts and searching for it. Then you install permissions and you configure them to only give access to the things that are on the warehouse worker role center.
Gotcha.
Makes sense.
So they should go hand in hand.
They should go hand in hand. And
Do you think there's any permissions that all companies should use?
the permission that all companies should use is a basic permission, and you can use the D365 basic permission set, or you can make one permission set. Usually what I do for people is I give them one permission set that gives access to all code units, XML ports, and the different object types that everyone needs to touch. So when you secure permissions, you're really only usually securing table data and maybe pages or reports, but mostly table data. Because if you don't have access to the table data, you can't really use any of the other objects anyway, so it doesn't matter. You might as well give everyone access to all the other objects to make it easier to manage.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Now, does that get tricky at all? Where, let's say that I'm I'm in accounts payable, and so I need to enter vendor invoices. So I enter purchase invoices. I pick the vendor, and then I get down to the line, and I need to enter a GL account number on the line. I need to have read access to the chart of accounts.
Correct.
Right? So by giving me read access to the chart of accounts, I could then go open up the chart of accounts page.
You could open up the chart of accounts page and see the chart of accounts numbers, but I would restrict the GL entries so that person can't see the specific entries, which makes them not be able to print most reports, most financial reports. That's the simplest modification not modification even, you're just changing a setting on a permission set, is the GL entries. Because if you lock the GL entries table so they can not read it, then they pretty much can't run any of the financial reports.
That's a really helpful tip, I think.
And that's the most common one that most people do, because most people just don't want everyone in their financials. And usually beyond that, most organizations think they need to lock everything down, but when you get them in a corner, they really just don't want people into the financials usually.
What percentage, and again, I know you've been doing this a long time and had helped many, many companies with this. What percent of the time are you able to train someone at the company, their system administrator, and then from that point, they, for the most part, manage all of the permission sets and user security on their own?
86.5%. No, I mean...
No, manage it on their own?
No, it depends. If they want to do it, 100%. If they really want to do it and manage it, everyone can do it if they have the wherewithal and the time to do it.
But I'm saying,
actually
we're sitting here in the real world.
In the real world?
In the real world, what's that percentage?
Probably more like 20 to 30%.
Okay, that's what I was thinking it was.
Yeah.
I thought it was a lower percentage. Right?
The good thing is, unless you're a changing organization that is implementing new modules and using different features, once you get it set up, everything's working, you pretty much don't have to touch it very often.
Right.
Maybe if you upgrade or if
And
you
is
change
I was going to
things.
say, what about updates, monthly updates, minor and major updates? Does that affect permissions?
So that's a bigger topic, yes. So now you're into that. So an upgrade, so say you're on premise, we'll start there. So you're on premise, you're on a version, say 2013, you're going to upgrade to BC 14. You upgrade, permissions have changed in the new version. You have to compare the permissions from the old version to the new version, and there's new permissions that you have to add. So there's a bunch that you have to add. So now you get into the BC Online world where you have major and minor updates. They're effectively coming out monthly, you know, and that every single time you get one of those updates, that's an upgrade. For all intents and purposes, it is an upgrade. So there's permissions changes that come out with every single major and minor update. So when that happens, if people have modified their permission sets in the system, they need to now compare them to the new one. And there's helpful things in there that they've put in BC. Like we talked about at the beginning, you can't modify a BC permission set, a Microsoft permission set, I should say. You can copy it. And when you copy it, there's a toggle that says notify me if permissions have changed. So when you copy it, you check that box, notify me when permissions have changed, then the minor update or major update comes out, and you'll get a message on top of the permissions page, the main permissions page that says these permission sets have changed. And it'll tell you all the permission sets that have changed. Now you have your new changed one. You compare that to your custom one that you had copied before, compare the two, do a simple Excel lookup and compare the two, and you see what's changed. And then you might have to add new tables that have been added via the update to your custom permission sets. So that's a mouthful, but yeah, you do.
No, it's good. So when you effectively say it's an upgrade, you mean because it's the same process as an upgrade, right? Where you're comparing the previous version to the next version every time another
Correct.
minor. Okay.
Yes, it's the same thing I do. When I do like an on-premise upgrade to another on-premise system, I'll compare the permission sets and find out what's new and see if I have to evaluate them with the key people of the company and decide we're putting these in your permission sets, here's the impact. Same thing, and end users can do that on their own. We have a process that we've published out that shows people how they can compare them, because this can happen on a monthly basis. So that's again one of the reasons why think about what you want to do, because if you're going to manage this on your own every month, changes. How much stuff do you really want to manage? What do you really need? You know, you got that security system in your house. You got to take care of those cameras and change the wiring and update it and do all that. It's the same kind of thing.
And I think for the most part, they try to, you know, those changes to permissions really will accompany the introduction of new features.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And those generally are the two major releases. But to his point, I think, you know, we have seen where Microsoft will release a new feature within a minor update.
Yeah.
You know, every new feature is not released during that, you know, that month of the major update. So it is possible you could run into permissions in those other months, but most of them you see in those major releases, which is why Microsoft created that ability to go copy your production environment to a sandbox and test it against the new version, because we've seen before where Microsoft has made a change to, I think it was to a Role Center page.
Yeah, so the change that happened before was on a minor update. Here's the scenario. Customer calls me up, oh my gosh, my people can't get in the system. It's giving them a permissions error just when they open up Business Central. I go in, look what's happening. Okay, Business Central is opening up, it's giving a permissions error immediately. Look, what's the table, what's the effect? Find out that it is a splash screen that pops up first on top of the Role Center when you navigate to Business Central. saying, here's a new feature, how you can upgrade Great Plains to Business Central. So something that most people running Business Central probably are not interested in. So then I just go in and I add the tables that feed that page into the permission set, and everything's fine. But to Ken's point, you can do that evaluation before the major or minor updates come out and figure out what tables are going to be added to the system, and you can add them to permission sets before the update even comes out and avoid all this. And it's not that's not even that big of a process. It might take half an hour to 1 hour to do it, maybe 2 max. It's not a big deal, but you got to stay on top of it.
Yeah.
I think Microsoft is kind of getting away from that practice of putting things directly as the very first page. I hope they are, because it's kind of bothersome.
I'll bet, one of the things that's great about Business Central Online is that, in the on-premise world, when Microsoft would do things like that, it was the partners who had to deal with the customers and help them resolve things. And I think in Business Central Online, they're hearing directly from end users and customers submitting support requests.
Yeah.
And hearing and seeing directly from them. Therefore, understanding more the impact that certain things are having, and able to change and adapt to how they do things more quickly, because they're seeing firsthand certain things that are happening. And I've seen that in a couple different instances.
Sure.
Where it's changing how they approach things.
It's good though.
When they're releasing it. Right. Oh yeah, it's good for everybody.
They're tailoring it so it works for everybody as opposed to...
Yeah, I could imagine when that update came out, it must have impacted anybody who was using that role center, which was a pretty general role center. I don't remember the name. And a pretty general permission set. It was the main one that most people use, and must have happened to a lot of people. And when we got the call, it was early in the morning, and jumped on it right away and figured out what it was. But I got to imagine a lot of end users logged in with custom permissions and got that, and then you're down. You're down for hours, potentially days, until it's fixed.
Do either of you know if Microsoft is still adding like new out-of-the-box role centers to Business Central? I haven't heard anything in a while.
I don't know if they're adding new ones. There's about 30 or so out there that are available.
I remember it jumped from like 10 to 30.
Now, not all of them. When you go into Business Central and you go choose a role center, you don't see them all.
Correct.
Because they're not all flagged to be visible in the Explorer, or they may not be enabled.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you go into the profiles page, I think, or roles page, you can see that some of them are not enabled or are not visible in the Role Explorer, which means that they're not effectively enabled or in use.
Yeah, I like to start with the role centers, and whenever it's a new implementation or a new use of this functionality, I always tell people pick a role center for every single person based on what their role is in the company, assign it to them, set the other ones to not visible so you don't see it, or maybe you do want some of them to be seen. I also put user groups in place. User groups are a new feature that came out a few versions back in NAV, and user groups it's basically a record where you can tie together users with permission sets and a role all in one. So a good example would be a new person starts in the company. You give them access to your system. They get a login. You put their user in a user group, and that they instantly get all the permissions and the role center they need and everything, and that's it. You don't have to go to the user card and assign it and all that. You just drop them in a user group.
So an organization maybe that has 30 or 40 salespeople, you just set up a salesperson role or permission set or group.
Yep.
Sorry, group.
Yep.
User group.
Yep.
And gotta get the terminology straight.
Yeah.
You set up a salesperson user group, and then that basically gives them everything they need. So there's no differences. It's consistent. It's quick and simple.
And an administrator should be modifying these role centers. You can go to the roles page and customize the role center. When you're customizing the role center, what you're doing is taking fields off they don't need to see, taking buttons and functions off they don't need to see, the people in that role, cleaning it up, moving cue tiles around, doing different things like that just to make the role match better for everybody. And when you make those customizations, as soon as you press done, every single person who has that role gets those changes automatically. So you can really get your organization locked down. Everyone's in the role. Everyone sees the same things. Everyone's got the same permissions.
Now, Business Central has out-of-the-box user groups, right?
Correct,
That come
yep.
with. Do you ever have like a conflict with those when you create new user groups or no?
No, I like to create user groups that are the same name as the role center. And then if I'm doing custom permissions, I'll make one main permission set. When I copy the permission set, I'll give it a name that's the same name as the role, so everything is the same. And then, sometimes we'll look at certain customers and see that they have a lot of permission sets. To me, less is more. Have as very few permission sets as you could possibly have. You have one main permission set, maybe one that has some basic permissions, and then any permission sets from any add-in providers that you're using. And that's it. You don't need a bunch of different permission sets. It makes it more hard to manage.
So I'm going to kind of challenge you a little bit here. I think you provided like a lot of really, I think, great tips and tricks and and help and how to do it. So one of the common scenarios that we see, especially in a smaller implementation, right? You have a lot of people who really have to get their hands in a lot of different things. Yep. They do some purchasing, they do some sales, they check inventory, maybe they're doing some manufacturing, but they go, I don't want them to see my financial statements, I don't want them to see GL budgets, I don't want them to get into my GL entries. What's the quick and dirty way to set that up? Or is there a quick and dirty way to effectively set that up?
So let's say we have 5 people in sales, we have 5 people in purchasing, and then there's 2 people that cross over into both areas. So those 2 people will each both have the sales permission set and the purchasing permission set, so they can do both of those things. And then you just take those permission sets and you take away the access to the GL entries, and that pretty much locks them down to not see.
But you can't just remove the GL entries table data from the main role, because you can't change those. So you have to you would copy.
I would copy it and give it a separate name,
and then remove. Yeah. Then you can remove the GL entries.
Correct.
And then assign that to them.
Yep. Okay. And I would do it through a user group, so it goes in a user group. So often you'll have like sales, a user group called general sales, and then super sales, meaning they can do more things. Maybe they cross over into purchasing, or you have different levels of salespeople. So bigger organizations, they'll have numerous roles for each functional area, and each one can do different things.
So why wouldn't you create a user group for every time you have to modify a person's permission?
For each person? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't do that because people should be in groups. You would do that if every single one of them was completely unique, but they're typically not.
Right. So a user group, right? Isn't it where you assign somebody a user group and effectively they get whatever permissions you assign to that group?
Yes.
So I would imagine instead of just modifying the permission for everybody, why wouldn't you just create a user group each time, and then when you get somebody new, eventually you can just add them to that particular user group?
That's what you do.
That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You're saying add it every time.
Well, you don't create a user group every time you modify permissions for a person, right?
No.
So I would say every time you modify permissions for somebody, why don't you create a user group?
No, you create a user group.
Well,
a user group is just a name. Say the user group is called salespeople, and then you put multiple people in the user group for salespeople, and you put whatever permission sets that user group needs. Now, when you need to modify permissions, you go modify the permission set. Once only. And that affects every single one of those salespeople. If you open up those salespeople's cards, you'll see the permission sets change on their cards dynamically. You don't have to do anything. So you can take, if you go, whoa, I'm taking this permission set away from all the salespeople, you take that one permission set out of the user group one time, it immediately gets removed from everybody. That's the power of the user group. So, you're going to add someone to the company, you just drop them in the user group. They get the role center, they get all the permission sets associated with that user group.
Is you go to a company and you got 10 employees, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've got one in sales, one in purchasing, one in whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You probably wouldn't create a user group for each one, right? You would just modify the permission for each person.
If you have one person in each department,
every time you're going to make a custom permission set for per person, why don't you just create a user group? Because in the future, you might just be able to add somebody to it. So I'm saying, wouldn't it be beneficial to create a user group every time you're going to create?
Not every time. I mean, you're not going to, every time isn't going to happen a lot.
How long does it take to create a user group?
1 second. New. You're pressing new.
You're making my case.
There's your user group.
Well, but Michael, the most likely scenario, though, in those types of organizations is that when you hire a second person, that second person is not going to get the exact same permissions as that other person that's been there for 5 years is going to have. You're going to want to limit them a little bit. So it gets to be where the fewer people you have, the less the benefit of the user groups is. Yeah. Our example of 20 salespeople is clear. And even if you had 20 salespeople, but 4 of them needed some additional permissions, what I would do is you'd keep the user group less, right? So that applies to all 20, and then add a new user group for the 4, and then assign that group to just the 4 people.
Yeah, so I do that, and even if the organization has 3 people, I still use user groups. No matter what, I always use user groups because I do not want anybody going into the user card and touching the permissions on the user card. Because often something will happen, a support case comes up, we don't know how this person has all this access or whatever the case may be, and I go, well, you're using user groups, but if I look at their user card, someone's manually added permission sets to the user's user card. So I don't even show people how to do that anymore. Use a user group, whatever you want these people to be in the user group, even if it's just one person, add it to the user group, and that's it. That's just the rule. And then for Ken's example, where you have a salesperson who has all this access and a new person starts, and they're going to have a little bit less, but a lot of the same access as the higher person, I would go to that permission set, copy it, give it a name that signifies that it's a little bit less. When you copy it, you get every single permission, and then you just take out a few lines. Take out the few things you don't want them to see, and then make your new user group, call it salesperson 2. And then you add the permission set there, add the person to it, and that's it. I always use user groups, and I always make them as small and defined as possible. That said, a person can have multiple user groups, and a user group can obviously have multiple permission sets. And so it is very flexible, especially when you get in the case where, you have half your company's sales, the other half's purchasing, except for this one person in the middle who does both. Give them both user groups. Now they can do both.
So what happens if in one user group they have permissions to do something, and then they're in another user group where they don't have permissions to do that? Which wins?
With permissions, the highest permission always wins. So
it's additive.
It's additive.
You have to have it existing for it to work.
Yeah, so if you have permission to the sales header table in one user group and another user group doesn't have access to that table, you'll still have it.
Gotcha.
I'm gonna go ahead and use the word tedious here.
Yeah.
Right? Is that a good word?
It can be. Yeah.
It sounds tedious,
sure.
Right? Yeah. Which is why the number you say 20% of customers are able to fully manage security on their own. You also said that you can kind of set it and forget it in a lot of cases, right? So it's something that if you get it set up well at the beginning, you've got it set up. No one's looking at it. No one's really thinking about it.
Correct.
And then at some point in the future, they want to make changes. No one remembers even how it was set up. Or the other thing I'm getting is there's options. You could use user groups. You could not use user groups. You could assign table data strategies or page and reports.
Mm-hmm.
So what that tells me is that two different people could approach security from two different ways. One way is not necessarily right or wrong.
Correct.
That when you see that it was set up this way, that it's really not fair to say, well, that was the wrong way to set it up.
That's correct.
That was just how they set it up.
Correct.
And you may have a different appearance. We see this in programming quite a bit, where the two developers take two different approaches to something. You end up with the same result, but it's like, why'd you do it that way? Well, it doesn't really matter.
That's
you get
the
the
way I
same
do it.
result, right?
Okay.
So I'm hearing that it's tedious, that there are options available, and that you do have to put some thought into it, right? So
sounds like it could get complicated too.
Yeah, that's why I'm focusing on doing it as simply as you can, as little as you need.
start small.
Start small and keep it as small as you possibly can. Another thing, you might make changes in permissions over time. Something might happen. I always push customers to keep a log. Keep an Excel spreadsheet somewhere on a network drive that shows. It still says here. But
Nobody wants to do that.
keep a
What?
list of every single thing you've changed. Because you've copied this permission set for a reason. If you've copied it and made it a custom one, you've done that for a reason to change something. Now you need to make changes to it. And you're taking tables out of it. You're changing different permission levels. Just keep a spreadsheet that says, I took away read access to table 18 for this permission set. That's it. Keep it all.
Yep.
So when your updates come along or your upgrade comes along, you realize and remember, oh yeah, I did change all these 4 things. Easier said than done, I know. And yes, people do permissions different ways. Another thing that I see a lot that makes it good to keep it small, if you look at one permission set, it'll have access to the sales header. If you look at another permission set, it'll have the same access. A lot of permission sets have the same access in them. So when you try to secure something, if you have a lot of permission sets, you got to go through each one and rip out of each one of them. So I just want one.
Yeah.
It's way easier.
Sage advice. Michael, you've got some questions for Simeon.
I do. We're going to end on this one, buddy. So you got 5 yes or no questions, okay?
Okay.
Speed round.
Everybody knows the rules. You answer only yes or no. You ready? Number 1, 5 years ago, did you believe that cloud software would be the wave of the future?
Yes.
Is green your favorite colored M&M?
Yes.
I'm sure Business Central is going to expand its use of artificial intelligence in the future. Will this require less permissions to be used?
No.
Are German Shepherds the best dog breed known to mankind?
Yes.
Do you recommend Business Central users to always contact their Microsoft partner when setting up custom permissions?
Yes.
There it is.
100%.
100%.
I don't know.
The
Maybe
M&M one got
80.
me.
The M&M, yeah.
Yeah, that was.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you again for joining us. I think you gave a lot of great advice and guidance on setting up permission sets, and hopefully just sparked some ideas in people's minds.
Yeah, they are tedious and there's a lot to them. That's why, and even this is a big session. So I would say keep it simple.
Thank you, Simeon.
All right, thank you so much. Next up, we're going to do a quick wrap up of everything, so stick around.